As 2022 comes to a close, so does Season 3 of Beards and Cars. So before we enter the new season in the new year, of course it's time to count down my top 10 favourite drives of the year, and of course crown my car of the year for Season 3. The previous winners were the Touareg V10 for 2019, the Jaguar XFR for 2020, and the Golf R32 last year in 2021. So we'll see in a moment, of course, what the winner this year for me was, but I will also say, for those who missed it, I now have a new channel dedicated just to beards and cars. You may have missed this. I put out a couple of community posts about it and mentioned it here and there, but for those who prefer my real-world beards and cars videos and aren't as interested in the gaming stuff, you might want to check out that channel, because not only are all of the future episodes going to be released both here and on that channel, but also I'm uploading the complete back catalogue of every single episode, every single review I've ever done. So daily uploads at 6 o'clock every day until something like February or March, and that's even releasing them every day. And then once they're all uploaded, we'll return to the normal schedule. So check that channel out if you haven't already. Now though, let's get into the list. First of all then, kicking us off in number 10, for me is the Peugeot RCZ. It's not as exciting of a pick as many of the others here, which is why it's lower, but to me the Peugeot RCZ, much like one other vehicle which we'll see much later on the list, was just such a shockingly good car. But also not so shocking because I thought it would be good. These are so cheap, so stylish, have excellent handling. I really like the interior and exterior styling. The only real drawback, to be honest, of the Peugeot RCZ is it's not quite as sturdy or robustly built as its main rival, the Audi TT. Aside from that, it's a genuinely lovely sports coupe which costs peanuts for what it is. You can absolutely use it often thanks to the fuel economy, the drivability, but also if you wanted to buy something cheap and tune it up and get yourself potentially like a modern incarnation of a Fiat Coupe Turbo Plus in terms of that kind of cult performance car, I could see you doing that quite easily with an RCZ. Next up in number 9, well, this one's going to be controversial for some people and shocking for many, because I've gone from giving the XFR my car of the year in 2020 to the XFRS 9th place this year. So why? For any who know me, I've mentioned a number of times prior to driving it that the XFRS was not only the number one Jag that I wanted to review, but it was pretty much my dream Jag, especially in the sport brake form, the super rare wagon. Well, it wasn't a bad car, but I will say that I think a combination of two things prevented it from being higher on the list. Number one, I already knew that it should be good, whereas the first time I drove the XFR, it was such a shock that it really went above and beyond. Now that's a me thing, that's not the car's problem. But again, this list is about my favourite drives, so it is subjective by definition. On the other hand though, the real reason why it doesn't finish higher is because as much as I still want to love the RS, it doesn't quite feel as complete all-round of an experience. That's again why I love the XFR so much. It's a muscle car, it's a sports car at heart, but it's also a comfortable, luxurious, smooth, practical executive GT for daily driving and for a great price. The RS cancels out a lot of those. It's a lot more expensive. It's a lot harder to find. It's not as comfortable. It's not as smooth. It's twitchier, sharper through corners, spins up its wheels easier. So for performance, of course, it's savage and it's a lot of fun, but it's really one of those cars that feels like you have to push it a lot more to really enjoy the car. The car doesn't feel as happy when it's being driven at normal speeds or more sedately or cruising. It just doesn't feel appropriate to that. It's a car that wants, deserves, and needs to really be pushed. And to me, that means it's just not quite as usable. Next up in 8th, though, we still have a four-door car. Quite a shocking one to beat out something like a Jaguar RS. But again, it's because this car, to me, just offers such a subtly good all-round package. The Alpena. The Alpena D3, of course based on the BMW 3 Series. It's the first Alpena model I've driven. It's a relatively subtle car by their standards in terms of what they actually did to it, but it's just a fantastic diesel sports saloon. These cars are ridiculously cheap on the used market, and the only problem with them is they tend to have extremely high mileage here in the UK, sometimes up around 200,000 miles on the clock, which if you think about it is a fantastic sign, because it means that they can keep going and going and going. Put simply, It's just a brilliant car. It looks special enough to stand out, but it's not over the top. It's got the space, the practicality, the all-round usability that the 3 Series has anyway. It's a hugely popular platform of 3 Series that they based it on, and the performance is really sprightly. It's not as quick as something like, an AMG, but it's more than quick enough to rival most hot hatches of the time, a sub 7-second 0 to 60, great handling, again, a manual gearbox for somebody who doesn't even like manuals. So for me to really enjoy it says a lot. If you are looking for a performance diesel that's a bit different than just your regular ho-hum Mercedes, Audi, Beamer diesels, definitely look into a D3. They're severely undervalued, but that makes them very good. Next up on the list, we return to Jaguar once again, and I think some people also won't be happy about how low this one is, but for me it's actually the XJR. I finally got around to driving the X351 shape. Now, for any who watched my review of this XJR, it's a vehicle which I think is completely mismarketed by Jaguar. This should not be called an XJR. This should be an XJRS, which of course doesn't exist, but it should, because that's exactly what this feels like. This feels 9/10 of what an XFRS is, and that's just not what I would want from an XJ. It feels too savage, too focused, too good in a strange kind of way. Not that that's bad, but there's just certain occasions where that doesn't suit a car. So if you could, for example, take a Range Rover and make it corner like a Lotus Elise, well, of course that would be very impressive, but would you want to live with that every day? Well, it would get tiring after a while, something that twitchy, that focused, that on all the time. Sometimes you just want to relax and be in a comfortable luxury car. To me, that's where the XJR kind of goes over the line. I would be very curious to, in the future, review the XJ Supersport, the 5-litre, which I believe is much closer to what an XJR experience would probably or should probably feel like for this particular generation of Jag. Great car, very impressive performance, much like the XFRS, but something about it just doesn't quite suit the XJR image for me. Again, it is a personal preference thing, but once again, that is the purpose of the list. Next up though, in 6th place, we have a car that kind of revisits my top 10 from back in 2020 in a sense, the BMW 6 Series, but back then it was the 640D, one of the most impressive cars I've ever driven, this time the 650i. So of course swaps out diesel for petrol, 2 doors for 4, but still such a fantastic platform. And there were a number of comments from owners, both longer term and more recent, who agreed with the sentiments. It's just such a deeply impressive car, which begs the question of why it's number 6. Well, of course there are 2 reasons. One reason is naturally just because the cars above it impressed me even more, which is an obvious thing to say, but secondly because I honestly would say if this were a 640D Grand Coupe, it might have scored higher. Because to me the 640D is that much more impressive because it's basically working uphill. Being a diesel puts it at an immediate disadvantage in terms of winning you over, at least for most people, whereas this, well, it's a 4.4 litre V8, it's very powerful, you'd expect it to be good. It's kind of like an M6 Lite, if you will. So yes, it's fantastic, but I didn't find the wow factor of the engineering and the packaging to be quite as remarkable as the diesel is, which is a strange thing to say, but I think if you compare the two and drive them both, you might feel and understand what I'm talking about. This one's good, but you expect it to be. The diesel is incredible, and you don't expect it to be as good as it is. That's the real difference. Next up, though, we move into the top 5, and this one is one of those cars which, as I said, was literally a bucket list vehicle for me, one of the more relatively recent additions throughout 2022, the Mercedes SLK 55 AMG, a car which is unfortunately belied by its somewhat cute image being a smaller, more round, softer looking little pit bull of a car, or a British bulldog kind of shape, but in a cute way, kind of like, the nodding Churchill dog rather than an actual pit bull. But that's the thing, because underneath the AMG is a brute of an engine dropped into a cute body. It's a great combination. I was really curious, especially after driving so many different Mercs already in past years, from old to new, some fantastic, some really not. This one was a curiosity to me. and it really delivered. The only thing about it which didn't quite, not so much live up, but didn't pan out in the way that I thought it would, is it's actually a lot more civilized than I expected it to be. I thought that the SLK was going to be a pure brawler, and even though it has that capability, the gearbox is a little bit more sedate, the ride is a bit more supple and more comfortable, and just the overall feel is much more forgiving than, on paper, a 360 horsepower V8 tiny convertible would sound. You know, it sounds like a Shelby Cobra from Germany. It doesn't really drive like that. It feels more like a tiny Bentley in a really good way. Now, though, we move into the top 4. Number 4, of course, had to be high on the list because, as any of you who have been watching Beards and Cars for many years now will know, the Jag XK is probably the single most popular car I've ever talked about on the channel. I've done loads of different variations of it, loads of different episodes and videos, and this is literally the one I wanted to review the most. Of any XK, my favourite one of all, before I'd even driven one, the RS. Specifically, the 4.2 generation. The super subtle, super rare, carbon chin splitter version with the larger wing, same power, but reworked suspension, unique wheels, higher top speed, more downforce. It's just the ultimate version of the 4.2 era, and it's a car that I've always loved. I, of course, own the normal 4.2R. This is even higher than that on the food chain, and also it was a really cool review to do because it's the first review I've ever done aside from my own cars that was privately owned. So that was a really cool experience, getting to work with a private owner. He really enjoyed the car being the star, I enjoyed working with him, and hopefully we can do more like that in future with different owners and different cars. So yeah, the RS for me is a car that definitely had a lot to live up to, but I'm happy to say that it really did. It managed to make an already brilliant car, the XKR, that much better, but without sacrificing any of its goodness. It's not too harsh, it's not too aggressive, it's not too sharp, it's just right. I think the way that I would describe this RS is, imagine if you took an XKR 4.2, gave it to ProDrive, and asked them to make it the best possible car it could be. That's really what the RS feels like to me. Now, though, we're on to the podium, the top 3. These top 3 are a very difficult 3 for me to move around, and I could talk myself into moving them around all day long, but I'm kicking off with number 3 with a literal dream car of mine, albeit in a slightly different spec, a relatively early one through the year, my favourite Aston Martin, the 4-door Rapide. Now, I drove the Rapide S, and what a machine. Stunning to look at inside and out, incredible sound, shockingly good actually, in terms of how it drives. I was expecting it to be similar in some ways to my time driving the Vanquish or the Vantage in previous years. In some occasions, Astons don't impress me that much. As weird as it is to say, they're sometimes a little bit lacking in character, a little bit harsh and kind of unwieldy on the road. This is not that at all. In fact, remarkably, it really feels like a Bentley, but in a good way. It has all of the kind of advantages of a Bentley, but it's not as big, it's not as heavy, and it's not as disconnected from the cornering appeal as a Bentley would be. So it really treads that fine line between being big, comfortable, and luxurious enough to be a legit super limo, but without sacrificing the supercar looks, the supercar performance, certainly the Aston Martin image with that tremendous V12. And to top it all off, even though £50,000 isn't cheap, I think that is a hell of a car for the money, and they are a lot more valuable still than their 2 best rivals, the Quattroporte, of course, which I've owned a couple of times, the Panamera, which is an absolutely astounding car. But yeah, the Rapide to me is the ultimate 4-door ever, period. The most beautiful 4-door car ever made, and yeah, finally getting to drive one was great. I wanted to let it ruminate over time in terms of not just being the rose-tinted glasses, especially when my favourite version is not the S anyway, I prefer the normal one. But yeah, just a genuinely brilliant car. Very much in the exotic tier, but also very much an impressive car. A car that didn't sell all that well, could have very easily been awful, but I think Aston did a fantastic job with it. And the only downside, in my opinion, of the Rapide is that the center console for the transmission that runs through the car between the passengers is way too big, because it makes the back a bit restrictive. It's a bit like being in a very small fighter jet. So for a car that's as long as this is, it's a bit of a disadvantage, but still, it is a four-door supercar, so you can give it a bit of leeway. Next up in second place though, you literally couldn't go more from one extreme to the other than this, from an Aston Martin to a Fiat. Yes, this is one of the only lists in the world wherein a Fiat will score higher than an Aston Martin in any way that matters, because honestly, not for the purpose of a joke, legitimately, the Fiat Panda 100 HP is an astonishingly good car. This, as crazy as it sounds, was also in my top 10 bucket list vehicles to review, because Evo magazine gave it their Car of the Year award way back when it first came out. I instantly fell in love with the look of the car. The value for money was tremendous. 10 grand, brand new. These days that just doesn't even happen for a car like this, but even at the time, around 2006, that was a big deal. This kind of modern interpretation of kind of like a Japanese K car, these small underpowered machines, or a classic Mini Cooper that does so much with what it's given. The Panda is just, honestly, it's completely it's unpretentious, it's unassuming, and yet it delivers everything you could possibly realistically want from a hot hatch experience. It doesn't need 300, 400 horsepower. It doesn't need a 20, 30, 40 grand price tag. It doesn't really need anything that it doesn't already have. It's just pure, simple, dirt cheap driving fun. Fantastic car. They are guaranteed to be future cult classics. They are still cheap for now, but I don't think they're going to be forever. It's destined to be a future Fiat 500 in my opinion, and I'm talking about the OG Fiat 500, not the newer ones, which are also good in their own way. But yeah, legitimately the Panda 100 HP is really that good. Just ask anyone who owns one. They're brilliant cars, they really are. But what is my car of the year? Well, my car of the year is something which I tend to try and avoid placing one of my own cars in. I tend to think that feels a bit like automotive nepotism in a weird kind of way, so I try to avoid it, but sometimes I just can't. I had to give the Touareg my 2019 award, even though it was my own car, and even though I didn't own the Golf R32 at the time of giving it the award, I ultimately ended up buying one, and it really was that good to make it my car of the year over the Range Rover SVR. This year, as much as I try and reason my way into having something else like the Aston or the Fiat in number one, I simply have to place this one here. My Car of the Year award 2022 goes to my 1968 Lincoln Continental, which, as many of you know, I affectionately call Abe Lincoln. This car is, honestly, the most astounding car I have ever driven, and that's regardless of if it's my car or not. Because simply put, forget how good it looks, forget how good it sounds, forget the nostalgia, just look at it from a factual perspective before we even get into the fact that it is subjective, but even just based on objective facts. This is literally a 55-year-old car which puts a Rolls-Royce of the time to shame. A Rolls-Royce feels like a bathtub compared to this. They were a similar price, but this has disc brakes as standard, a rubber-insulated steering column to reduce road vibration, seat belts front and back from the factory, auto-dimming headlights in 1968. It's a tank in terms of build quality. I had, of course, some work done on it, fitting a Holly Sniper fuel injection system, and when the mechanics were working on it, they said, it's solid. It's such a remarkably solid car for its age. It's unbelievable. And the testament to how good these cars is ironically that they were a failure. The 68 Continental was such a good car that they were a sales disaster. Because what Lincoln did, and of course I get into this more in my review for it, and you can find links to all of these vehicle reviews in the description below, but the reason why it was a failure is because Lincoln opted to fit everything that was an optional extra on a Cadillac as standard on the Continental. But the problem was, everyone who bought one never needed to buy one again. In fact, they never really needed to buy anything again because it was such a good car, so they destroyed repeat customers by making a perfect car. And to me, if any car can not only beat a Cadillac, which was America's Rolls-Royce, but literally be superior to an actual Rolls-Royce, which was still using drum brakes, etc., and was very primitive in comparison, well, to me, kind of by definition, that has to mean that at least until up to 1968, the Lincoln Continental was the best car of all time in terms of just that sheer level of outstanding engineering, craftsmanship, attention to detail, whatever you want to call it. And to me, a car that can still impress you 55 years later, a car which drives, honestly, like a modern car. I mean, even with the original disc brakes, the brakes are better on my Lincoln than many modern cars that I've driven. It holds the road far better than you would ever imagine a vehicle like it could. And even the engine comes from pre-fuel crisis times, so it's not underpowered. Sure, it's massive, and by today's standards you could get this kind of power out of a smaller motor, but 340 horsepower and the same amount of torque as a Bentley Flying Spur, close to the torque level of a Dodge Viper, is not bad at all for a naturally aspirated 1968 luxury car. It is a tremendous testament to what is, in my opinion, when America ruled the automotive world. The 50s and 60s, America was untouchable, and it was only the fuel crisis, in my opinion, that stopped that, and they never quite got back to form. This is an astounding car. I absolutely adore it. It's my favourite car I've ever owned. It may well be my favourite car I've ever driven, and it is definitely the most impressive single car I have ever driven to date. Without question, I have to give the Lincoln Continental my Car of the Year award. Not bad for a 55-year-old to win Car of the Year in 2022. And of course, we'll have to look to the future in 2023 to see what Season 4 of Beards and Cars brings. There are certainly always bucket list cars which I would love to add. We'll have to see how many of those pan out and how many which I wasn't planning pan out as well. So, if you followed all of the reviews from this year, or if you want to recap in the playlist, or even on the new channel, and of course tell me down below what your standout of the year was, maybe even something that I didn't mention at all. There were some other great ones for sure as well. And just as a quick recap, for those who don't know the cars I reviewed this year, I also reviewed my Bentley Flying Spur, the Jaguar X100 XK8, the Audi S5, the Dodge Ram SRT10. I re-reviewed the Nissan GT-R with a completely new angle on the review due to a technical issue, the Renault Clio 197 Cup, the Jaguar F-Type R, the Jaguar XJ V12, my own Mitsubishi Evo 7, a Nissan 370Z, the Audi RS7 Sportback. Of course, I reviewed my own Beard to mark 100k, and the Mark II Classic Jag. So it was quite the year, and I've actually done more classics this year than any previous year, which was very cool because I'm a huge fan of classic cars. So yeah, a very impressive year. Not as many cars as last year, but many of my favourites that I've ever driven were from this year. So that's it overall for my Car of the Year 2022. And of course, I look forward to you joining me for 2023. But that's it for this vid. I'll see you next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.